When it comes to the threats facing our nation today, a majority of people believe the biggest to be the terrorist organization that calls itself the Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL. A new Gallup poll finds 84% of Americans consider the Islamic State the most critical threat to American society. But as the Islamic State is increasing the frequency and the severity of its attacks, there's growing concern about how the U.S. is responding. In fact, 57% of people do not approve of how President Obama is handling the Islamic State, according to another poll out this week. That's up from 49% in September. Last week, President Obama requested permission from Congress to take military action against the Islamic State, with an offensive tailored to the group.
The United States should not get dragged back into another prolonged ground war in the Middle East. That's not in our national security interest, and it's not necessary for us to defeat ISIL. Local forces on the ground who know their countries best are best positioned to take the ground fight to ISIL, and that's what they're doing.
It's a complex situation with ever more complicating factors coming into play each day. Joining me now to talk about that is WGBH News contributor Charlie Sennott, head of the Ground Truth Project, co-founder of Global Post, and I should mention he has 25 years of experience reporting on the front lines in 15 different countries. Charlie, welcome back to Greater Boston.
Thanks, Adam. Good to be here.
Let me start out by asking you, is it realistic for the U.S. to attempt to defeat the Islamic State without committing ground troops?
No, I don't think you're going to succeed in defeating an enemy as committed and as determined as ISIS without ground troops. And the truth is, these advisors on the ground are fighting on the ground. So there are troops on the ground. And we're into a lot of semantics these days in the war against terrorism. And I think words matter, but realities matter more. And I think the truth of the moment is that ISIS is showing itself to be more committed than we anticipated, more determined than we ever imagined.
Not the JV team, as the president famously characterized it, right?
To borrow another bit of language that was really a big part of this, they have underestimated ISIS. ISIS is a very determined enemy and a unique enemy, uniquely apocalyptic, and I would say uniquely nihilistic. This is a death cult. This is a different level of darkness than anything we've faced. And I say that not only because of their great attack on journalism and freedom of expression, directly on what we do, but look at what they did in Egypt. Look at what they did with 21 Christians lined up and beheaded. We're dealing with a different caliber of enemy, and we're going to have to put everything we can in if we really believe in what the president is saying, which is to not only degrade but destroy ISIS. You're going to have troops on the ground, I'm sorry to say.
I want to get back to Egypt in just a moment, but first, there was, of course, another terrorist attack in Europe over the weekend in Copenhagen where Omar el-Hussein murdered one man at a free speech debate and then killed a Jewish security guard at a synagogue before he was killed by police. What does this tell us, if anything, about the way terrorism works right now?
Well, I think this is the big fear of a copycat attack. This is what everyone was saying in Paris after the attack on Charlie Hebdo and then on the kosher supermarket, that we may see copycats, lone gunmen, if you will, who are inspired by ISIS or inspired by Al-Qaeda in Yemen as they were in Paris, and that we'll see these kinds of attacks emerge in other European capitals. I think Copenhagen is the glaring case in point that this is now happening.
And it now seems actually that there may have been some communication between the Copenhagen shooter and the Charlie Hebdo shooter.
There has to have been, because these are patterned attacks, right? I mean, to go one after one of the cartoonists who has depicted the Prophet Muhammad in what is seen as a blasphemous way by pretty much anyone who is a traditional Muslim, not just an extremist. And then to then turn from that to an attack on the Jewish community itself. And I think there's a pattern here, a disturbing pattern, and I'm really worried about more copycats.
The president has taken some heat for the terminology he's using to describe these attacks. He recently spoke with the website Vox and gave an interview in which he made a comment that raised a lot of eyebrows. Let's take a look at what the president said.
My first job is to protect the American people. It is entirely legitimate for the American people to be deeply concerned when you've got a bunch of violent, vicious zealots who behead people or randomly shoot a bunch of folks in a deli in Paris.
Some people said randomly was a gaffe on the president's part because that deli was a kosher deli targeted because it was a Jewish establishment. But writing for The Atlantic, David Frum went further. He said President Obama described the Paris attacks as random, not in order to conceal the Jewishness of the victims, but because for deeply considered reasons, he didn't want to acknowledge the anti-Jewish ideology of the assailants. Frum's bigger contention in this piece was that the president has made a strategic choice not to call Islamic extremist terrorism by that name. So I'm wondering if you think the president's vocabulary is appropriate or problematic.
This is a president who is a grand orator, and he cares a lot about words, and he's very good at putting them together. He's also a professor, and he sometimes parses his words a little too carefully. To call those attacks random is to ignore the obvious intention, which is to kill Jewish people, because at the heart of ISIS's ideology is something that goes far beyond anti-Semitism. It goes into a psychotic kind of hatred. And I think when you try to water that down with words, you risk failing to understand who you're up against. That said, when the President of the United States talks about not wanting to use the word Islamic terrorist, I can see where he's coming from there, because these terrorists have nothing to do with the faith of Islam. Or I should say, they have about as much to do with the faith of Islam as someone who would shoot up an abortion clinic has to do with the faith of Catholicism. We can separate very often in our culture between an extremist belief and then the core of those believers, and how different that is and how hateful that extremist expression is, and that it has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. If there is somehow someone like John Salvi, when he shot up the abortion clinics here, he had been at Catholic Church and been going consistently to Mass and influenced by a lot of the conversation there about abortion. We have to be sophisticated in our view of Islam, and look at countries like Indonesia, where there is moderate Islam and a functioning democracy. We have to think about them in very complex contexts.
And not speak reductively and assume that...
Exactly. The president needs to also be aware that you can't be so precise and cut the line so close that you miss the obvious. In this case, I think he did.
You mentioned Egypt earlier and Libya. Actually, I can't remember if you mentioned it or just hinted at it, but Egypt is now bombing Libya in retaliation for this attack by people affiliated with ISIS, this beheading, brutal beheading of 21 Coptic Christians.
Right.
These Christians, as I understand it, were actually kidnapped in eastern Libya. So why is Egypt embarking on an air war?
These are poor Coptic Christian Egyptians who look for jobs like so many other people in that part of the world. There's a flow across lines, and migration for work is a very common thing. That's why they were in Libya. They were looking for work. The Coptic tradition is one of the most ancient Christian traditions, but the Copts are very much seen as a proud part of Egyptian culture. They haven't always been treated well. There have been attacks on Egyptian enclaves, and Egyptians and churches have been targeted throughout Egypt's history over many, many decades, not just with Islamic extremists, but going back in history. There's always been some tension there. But when you really get down to it, when you talk to an Egyptian, they're very proud of the plurality of their culture. They're proud of the Egyptian Christian presence. And I think al-Sisi is responding to that. He's saying, these are our people too, and we're going to respond. Much the same way Jordan responded when its pilot was captured, burned alive, and they directly confronted ISIS on its own turf. I think al-Sisi's eager to jump in the mix here, but I would quickly add, with great peril. This is really rapidly becoming a regional conflict. Jordan coming in, now Egypt. The United Arab Emirates is also coming in. You know, I had an assessment from someone from the War College the other day, really a chilling analysis that where this is heading is regional war. Now, God forbid, and I hope that's not the case, but it does seem to have a lot of the parts coming together in ways that we need to be really concerned and watch it very closely.
On that ominous note, I got to ask you about something that you at the Ground Truth Project have been involved in. You've helped come up with this new sort of code of principles and safety procedures for foreign correspondents to follow and news organizations to follow. Tell me a little about
Sure. It's a call for global standards and practices for safety for journalists in the field. It's too long a name, so we just call it the call. And the call for safety for journalists comes at a time of rising peril for journalists in the field. And so what we're saying is we need to come together now. The journalists in the field, the news organizations who hire them, whether as freelancers or as staffers or as local correspondents, and we need to come together to say we have to have a shared set of values. And we need to have a shared culture of safety amid this rising peril. So these standards were drafted by a group of us, And we now have 30-plus news organizations who've signed on, including AP, Reuters, we have the BBC, we have The Guardian, we have USA Today. Very proud to have been part of this effort, and I think it's just the beginning. We need to really focus on safety for reporters in the world.
When I was looking at the call, what struck me were actually a couple of things. First, the push to be more methodical when it comes to reporting in the field, sort of scrutinizing every decision you're about to make, plotting things out, not taking unnecessary risks. And then also this exhortation to news organizations to treat freelancers the same way they would their staffers. Fair to say those are two of the big takeaways?
They are huge takeaways, and it's a really new culture in which more and more news organizations are relying on freelancers. Foreign reporting is expensive, it's hard to do, so if we're going to use freelancers, we have to be sure they're trained properly, we have to be sure they're insured, we have to be sure they're working closely with an editor on risk analysis and that we're going forward. This is a time of unusual peril. We've always faced risk as foreign correspondents. We've always had to do our best to stay out of the crossfire. But these days we're really in the crosshairs. I think it's a different calculus, and we need to be more careful than ever.
Briefly before we go, if people want to check it out, is that part of the new Ground Truth Field Guide?
Yeah, so the Ground Truth Field Guide from the Ground Truth Project is available online at our site, thegroundtruthproject.org.
Right, so groundtruthproject.org, okay.
And that is free to everyone who would like to look at it. It's a set of principles we've had for a long time, but now we've embedded this new global call for safety standards into the field.
We'll put a link on WGBHnews.org as well.
That'd be great.
Charlie
Thanks,
Sennett,
Adam.
thank you for coming in.
Thank you.